Some people know him as the most famous farmer in the world. He calls himself a Christian, libertarian, environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer. Joel Salatin, the Shenandoah Valley-based American farmer and philosopher and troublemaker, is anything but a lunatic. And he's the perfect person we've chosen to kick off our Regenerate series in a conversation about the soil, the environment, politics, and what it means to be a farmer in early 21st century America. So it's not often that one has the honor of talking to a Christian, libertarian, environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer. But Joel Salatin is all those and more. Joel, in terms of that epithet, what most interests me is the lunatic farmer bit. Are you a lunatic farmer? Or perhaps another way of putting it, are all farmers lunatics?
Oh, no, not at all. The agriculture there's an orthodoxy in agriculture that assumes certain things, and so there's a very much an orthodoxy in agriculture. There's an assumption of things, and as I began traveling more and getting a little more famous, I realized just how I was completely opposite of this mainline narrative, and I could either be depressed about that and frustrated and angry, or I could just embrace it and say, okay, that's fine. They think I'm a lunatic. I'll just take it and have fun with it. And so I found that it takes a lot of that tension and edge and off of a conversation. I just come in, sure, I'm the lunatic farmer. Now, what do you want to know? and it just makes it easy.
Yeah, I love the idea of a lunatic farmer. And of course, you began your career not as a lunatic farmer, but in my business as a journalist. How did you go from journalism to farming?
Well, I always wanted to be a farmer. I grew up here on the farm. I love the farm. I got my first chickens when I was 10 years old and started selling them in the neighborhood. I supplied a couple of schools and restaurants. And my dad and mom never made a living from the farm. Mom was a school teacher. Dad was an accountant. And so as I'm growing up as a teenager, and so how do I make a living on this farm? Okay, it's a nice place to grow up and build forts and dams in the creek and all that, but how do we make a living? And I had a definite writing. Every essay contest I entered in, grade school, high school, college, I won every essay contest. And so I love journalism. I love news. I'm a bit of a news nut. And so at my junior year in high school, I got a part-time job as the night receptionist at the local newspaper. And I police reports, obituaries, things like that, answer the telephone, love the newsroom. I mean, it was intimidating for me. And so then, went off to college, and that was during Watergate, during the Nixon era, and Woodward and Bernstein. And it dawned on me, the way to get to the farm is to write a bestseller. Then I can come to the farm, and with alternative source of income. So I majored in English and went back to the newspaper for 2.5 years. And I didn't write a bestseller, but I was able to live here and be able to get back to the farm through kind of that journalism. And now I'm thrilled that all of that communication skill has served me very well in preaching this message of lunacy.
Joel, your farm, of course, is in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, one of the most beautiful parts of America. What is it about the soil or the land that you love so much? Is it as a concept? Is it a physical thing? Is it aesthetic? Is it philosophical?
Well, I think it's all of the above. Now, to be sure, every place has its own paradise. So I don't begin to think that this is the best place to farm, the best place to live. I mean, we like it and we think it's beautiful, but every place on the planet has its beauty. And every place has its soil. And of course, soils are different, but soils run to organic matter decay, to vegetation, and to, to stewardship. And the same thing, grow soil here or heal soil, make fertile soil here, also make fertile soil in Australia, Germany, Mongolia, any place on the planet.
In some ways, Joel, you're a theorist of the soil. For someone like myself who is a layperson when it comes to these things, what does the soil mean? Is it literally the dirt you pick up when you bend over in the field?
Well, yes, it is. And the reason that the soil is so important is because all the wealth of civilization hinges on the soil. The rise and fall of every civilization in history, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, the Persian, the Persian area, and modern anthropology and archaeological exploration. We're actually learning even more about this from ancient times. But the truth is that every great civilization was created and built out of its soil wealth, and it fell as its soil eroded and was depleted. This is the history of nations. And so America, the United States here, my goodness, we were bequeathed an incredible wealth of soil when the European settlers came here. And much of our wealth not only has been because of our freedoms, our liberties, and all those things, but it's also been because we had this natural repository, some of the most fertile soils on the planet here, and we are still as a relatively new country as opposed to Europe, we are still turning that wealth into cash.
You mention cash, Joel. You include being a capitalist in your quirky biography. Some people might argue that capitalism and a love of the soil and of farming don't go together because capitalist farmers, by definition, exploit the soil. Is that fair?
Well, it is fair. It is fair. I mean, the moniker, the early American moniker, "Go West, young man, go west," was primarily because the eastern soils along the Atlantic seaboard, where Europeans had lived for 100 years by that time, were already depleted, and even the writings of Thomas Jefferson and his buddy John Taylor of Caroline County, James Madison, the soil associations. A lot of people don't realize that in colonial America, there were massive soil associations. I mean, our economy, agrarian economy at the time. It was not an industrial economy. It was not an information economy. It was an agrarian economy. And so Thomas Jefferson, as a very large landholder, was the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffett of his day. And so the initial wealth of the country was not from manufacturing. It was that we were able to grow tobacco and cotton and grain that we could ship to Europe. And of course, all of those things deplete the soil. They're animals, and they extract the fertility of soil. And so even by Thomas Jefferson's day, the "Go West, young man, go west" was because we were using up these eastern soils, and so we were constantly looking for new soils to exploit out west. And so that has been the bane of civilization from day one, and of course is the American trajectory as well.
But Joel, you're a capitalist and a farmer and an environmentalist. What do you do on your farm in the Shenandoah Valley, which is so different from many other farmers, in terms of respecting the soil, replenishing it, making sure that it's not totally exploited?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I think just for introductory context, the first thing we need to appreciate is that when we came to this farm in the Shenandoah Valley in 1961, our family, we were newcomers to here. 1961, um, this area had lost between 3 and 5 feet of soil. So when we came to our farm today, back then, there were large areas of rock that where there was no soil. All the soil was gone. Gullies. The deepest gully we measured was 16 feet deep. I mean, that's a massive gully, 16 feet deep, and all the hillsides were these gullies. So it was it's very much like a skeleton that'd been picked over by vultures. The flesh was gone, the soil was
Mm.
gone, and it was just a carcass sitting there. And so we looked at this carcass. My dad was a visionary. He was way ahead of his time, and he said, well, how does nature build soil? Does it build it with plows and John Deere tractors and 10 chemical fertilizers, or some other approach? And so as we began looking at that, well, what's nature's template? Where are the fertile soils? How did they get there? And so what you start noticing is that the most fertile soils in the world are in prairies. They're not forests. They're prairies with herbs on them. And animals are an integral part of the ecology. And so we knew we wanted to farm with animals. We had to start with grasses and perennials, eliminate or almost no tillage, not plant annuals, go to perennials rather than annuals, and allow these animals to rotate and move around the ecosystem rather than being confined in a house and a building, segregated from their ecology, where their manure that's supposed to be a liability, and the crops that feed them are grown with chemical fertilizer excavated from someplace else. And so there was a highly complex, relational, integrated symbiosis of plant and animal ecology that we developed, that to conclude, today we now have moved the farm from 1% organic matter in 1961 to over 8% organic matter today. Organic matter is the sponginess of the soil. It's what makes the soil soft and friable. And so from 1 to 8% there, and all of these big rock areas that were solid shale rock when I was a child now have a third of a meter. That they have 13 to 16 inches of soil on them. Now it's not 5 yet, but those rocks are gone. They're covered up with soil. So we've actually built soil over time. So the beauty of this, the great hope is, that we can indeed build soil. That's a very hopeful thing.
Joel, many people will know your experience, your model, your experiment from Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma and Fooding. You were featured in both. And in many ways, you're one of the pioneers, I don't know whether you'd like this phrase, of this new organic farming movement. It's still, though, a minority of American farmers. Are most American farmers doing it the other way because they're simply greedy and exploitative, or are they ignorant? They just don't get it.
That's a fairly pejorative question. And so yes, the answer is, of course, we are still a minority. I mean, probably still less than 3%. So 97% is still, I would call it exploitive. What they would say is, well, we're feeding the world, and you can't regeneratively feed the world if you're losing soil. Why? Well, I paradigm. I think it's I don't want to just look. I don't think anybody has evil intent. My favorite devil is Monsanto, And I don't even
Mm.
think Monsanto has evil intent. I think those folks there really think they're being helpful. They're sincere minded. I don't think it does good to whatever disparage motivation or intent, even of people I disagree with. And so I have to assume that they have good intent and that they're sincere. But the fact is that we now have a dead zone the size of Rhode Island in the Gulf of Mexico. That is strictly because of farming. We now know that every bushel of corn costs us about 3 of soil. We're still losing more soil in America than would fill a train from the Earth to the moon and halfway back. We're still losing that every year, and so we know we're on this. Well, there's an old Chinese proverb that says, "If you keep going the way you're going to end up where you're headed."
Yeah.
and uh, and and so our trajectory is still toward oil loss, infertility, desertification, and a bad situation. I mean, our country, we've only really been going at this heavily now for a century. That's not very long in nature's time space.
So, Joel, you see a very clear relationship between the exploitation of the soil and global warming and this, what some people see at least as an imminent environmental catastrophe.
Well, yes, I do. Again, if you travel very much around the world and you see, for example, the dust storms of Mongolia that come even here to North America, and you see the march of northern Africa, the dryness of Morocco, jumping the Mediterranean, coming into southern Spain there, and you see the expansion of the Sahel, um, and some of the expansion of deserts in India and things like that. You begin, if you start looking at this fairly, you begin realizing that we're on a collision course with sustainability. We are now. Um, I am not quite as much an alarmist. I mean, there are some people, friends of mine, who say we only have whatever 30 years left and we're all going to die. I mean, there's
Mm.
every kind of extreme you can imagine. There's some people that think our trajectory is so bad we're already over the tipping point and we're all going to die anyway. Um, I'm not of that ilk. I think that there's a tremendous amount of positive that we can do if we begin managing correctly. So I'm not opposed to agriculture. I'm opposed to the management of the land that 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 reduces the natural, the commons, and the ecological equity that's out there. And that's not about cows. It's not about corn. It's not about anything. It's about how we actually manage the land.
So let's talk about the ways in which we can solve some of this stuff. Is the beginning everyone to have Joel Salatin style small farms, to go back to that sort of Jeffersonian model of American uh, capitalist democracy, quote unquote, um, and to somehow eliminate these industrial capitalist farms of thousands of acres which deeply exploit the land, or is it not a matter of size?
Thank you for putting that on the end. It really is not a matter of. You will never find me disparaging large farms. Now, it's true that the larger the farm, often, generally speaking, the larger the enterprise, the less nimble it is. And so it's easier to turn a speedboat than an aircraft carrier. And so scale does generally make an outfit more stationary, more bureaucratic, more there's more invested in a certain in a certain worldview. So nimbleness is easy at a smaller scale, but the management, for example, not feeding herbivores corn. Let's just take that. Not feeding herbivores grain would drop grain consumption by arguably around 30% globally. And if we turned all of that ground back into perennial prairie, we don't have the bison anymore. We don't have the wild ungulates, but we do have domestic stock, and we have technology, electric fences, to be able to move these pruners, these four-legged pruners, around the landscape with more precision than they were moved with flies and coyotes and wolves, in prehistoric times. And so we can actually duplicate the soil building wealth of the prairies with domestic livestock by duplicating those movement patterns that we know historically, built those ecosystems way in the past. Interestingly, when we start doing that, guess what happens? We start seeing increasing wildlife. We have better habitat for pollinators. We have less chemical use. We have less erosion. Aquifers begin to fill better. We have less denuded soil. The soil is covered with more vegetation. That vegetation exudes bacteria, and the bacteria is hydrophilic, so that the bacteria is the number one way that condensation from water transpiration can condense and make a cloud and have rain. So vegetation then stimulates the hydrologic cycle, which then reduces desertification, helps the rivers to flow, the aquifers to fill. All of these things happen. So what we have is a tillage-based, grain-based agriculture, and with annuals as opposed to perennials. And as you remove the animals and the perennials, what you do is you denude the landscape, and you break down every one of these symbiotic relationships that ecology wants to use to actually build the soil.
You use this word symbiotic, Joel. You also describe yourself as a Christian. Is there a religiously metaphysical element to the land? Do you think one needs to be a Christian to really, or at least to be religious, to have some idea of some extra human force, to really appreciate the phenomenon that you're describing and dealing with?
What a profound.
Let me make the question a little bit more brutal and vulgar. In our godless world, is one of the reasons why we fucked up the environment our godless world?
I'm not sure about that, because a lot of crazy things have been done in the name of religion, and certainly, the religions out of the Middle East, whether they're whatever they have not resulted in revegetating the land and turning back deserts. So I'm not ready to say that it's religion. Now, that being said, I do think that there is a humility that comes across when we appreciate there's something bigger than ourselves. But obviously the naysayer would say, well, the conquistadors were serving something bigger than themselves as well.
Yeah.
They killed all the Incas, in the name of God and the emperor and all this. And so I think some of it may be simply viewing life as fundamentally, as viewing biology as fundamentally different than animate structure. I think that that it's more almost more an eastern western kind of thing. That in the East there's this connectedness, we're all relatives, a bit of a mystical, you know, there's more to you than you. In other words, if we took you, Andrew, and laid you on a table and dissected you all up, we could say, here's the liver, the heart, the lungs, the tongue, and the hair. This is Andrew. And Easterners would say, no, that's not Andrew. Andrew's more than his parts. Okay.
Mm.
In the West, we have more come to embrace this mechanistic, empirical, parts-oriented disconnect, kind of thinking that, well, that this mystical spiritualism is that's kind of backward. That's for people who can't figure it out. And so we have allowed ourselves the conquistador hubris mentality to think we can manipulate, we can dominate, we can insert DNA here. It's all it's like a big automobile, and we just need to figure out the right spark plug and the right carburetor and the right steering wheel, and voila, we've got functional biology. But the fact is, biology is far more than just empirical parts and empirical pieces that you can take apart and put back together. And every day now we're learning how much more complex and amazing. I mean, just that a clover seed can fall on the ground and it can be viable for 1,000 years. And year 1001, it decides, I think I'll germinate this year. Why? Why would it not germinate year 1, year 2, year 3, century 1, century 2? There's a biological wisdom there that's way beyond our ability to comprehend. And so that's why, for example, when I'll give you a good example, several years ago, for about decades, farmers like me taken to special classes to learn how to more cheaply feed cattle. We took dead cows, we ground them up, we cooked them, and then we fed them back to cows. And this was all promoted by the USDA and the agriculture experts. And I said, now wait a minute. I look around the world and I don't see where an herbivore eats carrion. I'm sorry, I can't see it anywhere. And until I can find it, I'm not going to feed dead cows to my cows. And of course, I was called a barbarian, a Luddite, anti-science. Go back to your cave. What do you want? To go back to wringer washers and hoop skirts and, all this stuff. 30 years later, suddenly there was this big global, as you remember, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also known as mad cow. And suddenly the whole world took this big, oops, maybe we shouldn't ought have done that, and realized. So we didn't feed dead cows to cows, not because we hated science, not because we didn't want progress, not because we didn't want technology or didn't like, government policy. We did not do it because we appreciated there was an order and a template in nature. Even if we don't understand it, we assume that there is a wisdom beyond our empirical understanding. In the movie Jurassic Park, that's such a great one. And the raptors and stuff, they're eating everybody and getting ready to destroy the world as we know it. And of course, the archetype there, the journalist gets in the face of the scientist, who, in the face of this mayhem, is completely euphoric over, oh, look what I've done. This is a wonderful thing that we've done. And the journalist says, but sir, just because we can, should we? That is a pregnant question. That's a pregnant question. And that's where I think East meets West. That's where spirit meets empiricism. That's where what we can see meets what we don't see.
So I've got a really pregnant question for you now, Joel. You brought up mad cow disease, and you got yourself in a little bit of trouble earlier this year when I think you wrote, "I want coronavirus." Now, of course, you don't really want it, but your point was that that this current the current
Yes.
paranoia we have about catching coronavirus is bound up with a bigger problem of immunology and the way we live our lives. And this may sort of bring in another of the words you used to describe yourself, libertarian. How should the government today be dealing with the coronavirus crisis? Should they be just letting people get it?
Well, you're putting me on the spot, and you're a very difficult question. So I will say, from my perspective, I don't think it's the government's prerogative to do anything about the coronavirus. I think it's up to the states, the local people, individual, personal choice. If you want to go to a football game in a stadium, and you feel comfortable going, go. And if you don't go. And what we do know, I don't think anybody would say that there aren't at-risk people. I don't want to run into a nursing home right now. There is certainly place for risk and non-risk, but my goodness, to you know Wester, the point is that we need each other's bacteria. Our immune system functions on touch. We live in a bacterial soup, and if we don't interact with each other, we're actually denying our immune systems from being able to interact with other people's immune systems. I mean, we babies are born. You don't build immune systems in a baby by putting them in bubble wrap. You let them run around on the floor. They eat dirt. They put dust bunnies all over themselves. This is how they develop an immune system. And throughout this whole process, I'm actually very frustrated that everything has been about a vaccine, some sort of a magic bullet, and nobody is talking about how do we build an immune system? How do we increase our immune system? Here on our farm in C years, we've had 4 disease outbreaks. One was in cows. 2 have been in chickens, and 1 was in turkeys. Okay, so I can count. In 60 years, we've had 4 epizootics. Okay, outbreaks of disease. Every single one of them was my mistake. Every single one of them. In other words, I either crowded animals, I didn't clean waterers, I didn't do basic sanitation stuff. One of them, I used some calves to control some brambles and turned them into pin cushions, which made them susceptible to this anaerobic bacteria. But the point is that when we have an animal get sick, we don't assume we didn't use the right vaccine or we didn't use the right concoction. Our first assumption is, what did we do to break down the immunological function? We assume that nature is healthy, and if it's not, we probably did something to mess it up. And when you realize that 70%, I think I'm right on this percentage, 70% of all human illness is lifestyle related. We don't sleep enough. We don't forgive. We don't hydrate. We don't drink water because municipal water tastes bad, so we don't drink it. We eat bad things. We drink 2 Coca-Colas a day. We have too much sugar. There's a combination of diet and spirit and emotion and health and all these things. And we know stress is a huge factor in immunological function. And nobody, none of the experts, the gurus that are on the news every night, nobody is saying, here's a 5-point recipe for you to build your immune system. sleep sleep 8.5 hours tonight, drink a gallon of water tomorrow, um, get in the sunshine for 1 hour, even if it's just a walk, um, eat eat food that you can pronounce. I mean, these are very basic things, and yet
Even
no,
even quinoa.
yeah, even quinoa, yeah, even quinoa, hummus.
But Joel, in all seriousness, this is really where you come in. Okay, you can't. What you're doing on your farm in the Shenandoah, it's not going to get people to walk. It might not result in them drinking more water, but it's all about eating. It's no coincidence that the people who are dying in the coronavirus crisis are people who are overweight, who eat too much sugar, who are generally unhealthy. And the reality is that this crisis should strengthen the argument of organic farmers like yourself. The best
Yes,
way to stay healthy is to eat good meat and grains and be
right.
responsible to your body in the same way as you're being responsible to the soil. Is that fair?
Yes, it is fair. It's very fair because the foundation of health is the entire habitat, which includes fuel, the fuel, whole body, mind, soul habitat that we create for ourselves. And if we all just sit around saying, well, I can take a pill or a vaccine or the doctor will fix me or whatever, and it doesn't matter what I eat, how I live, then we open ourselves up to a breakdown, to dysfunction. And if I could say one more thing, I think the whole quarantining spreading out. Uh, I can assure you when we look at the data, there's very much an urban-rural divide in the coronavirus outbreak. There's no question that the more dense the living, the more susceptible the population. I mean, that's just become that. I don't think anybody would argue with me on that. So if we say that one of the best solutions to outbreaks like this is space, is a little more spreading out, then one of the things that we need to think about is how to decentralize agriculture. We have had an unprecedented acceleration of centralization and amalgamation within the industry. I mean, fewer than 100 processing plants process all the chickens, or like 98% of the chickens in the country. Um, in my worldview, this would be perhaps 200,000 plants, democratized, decentralized, spread around the
Mm.
countryside, proximate to the chickens, bio-regionally producing, and the chickens wouldn't have to travel very far. They'd be neighbor friendly, community friendly, and the waste streams, the guts and the feathers and the blood, would not overrun the ecology of the place where the processing facility was. Maybe these are small. Maybe they only do 150,000 birds a year, but they're scattered all over the country. The fact is, when you spread out things like this, and you um, and you decentralize, you simply create a more resilient system. And it's quite amazing right now to even see large business publications talking about resilience and efficiency. Um, we've built this system for efficiency, but efficiency, as you move, when Joel Arthur Barker wrote the book Paradigms, whatever, 40 years ago, and invented the term to the world, paradigms, one of the axioms of paradigms that he presented was every paradigm eventually exceeds its own efficiency. In other words, you head toward efficiency, and eventually it breaks down because you simply can't run efficiency into into an endless place. And so perhaps our food chain, which now John Tyson, CEO of Tyson Food, he says our food chain is broken. Perhaps that is a result of chasing efficiency without asking the question, where do we start tipping away from resilience in our effort to efficiency?
Joel, finally, is the crisis an opportunity to rethink and rebuild the way in which people buy food? Because just as on the farming end, we've had the consolidation and the commodification of food and farming, the same is true on the retail end. Do we need more farm-to-table restaurants? Do we need more farmers markets? I don't know how the meat and vegetables from your farm gets onto people's tables, but is that last piece of the puzzle, is that key as well?
Well, yes, it is, and I think and here again, I don't want to be cultish on the local sourcing. I do think that the more diverse a bioregion has, the more resilient it is. And so in context, yes, we want to see more direct sales between farmer and consumer. We want to see more this direct collaboration, and I would just say a shorter chain of custody between the farm and the plate. That said, there is a lot of good farmland in the country that's not close to population bases, and so the fact that we now have extremely logistically efficient distribution, and here I use the word efficient again, but the ability now to distribute on a small scale, to use what the big distribution companies have pioneered and bring that down to small scale is possible now. It's possible. So our farm now, we ship nationwide. And so for people that don't want to go out, who want stuff on their doorstep, who don't want to get back in the car and sit in the traffic for a left-hand turn, that option is now available. I think it's a combination of a lot of things, but absolutely, I do believe that many more participants in that retail food will simply add options, choice, and resiliency, and that's a good thing.
So Joel Salatin, I want to thank you for a wonderful interview. I have to say it's been extremely informative. There's only one thing that's disappointed me. Your brand says you're a lunatic farmer, but you're not actually a lunatic, really, are you?
Well, no, we think we're, we think we have a lot. We don't have all the answers, but we think that we've found some real solutions. And everybody else is crazy. But it's easier for me to say, hey, I'm crazy, than it is for everybody else is crazy. That just alienates people. So it's fun to laugh at yourself. I don't take myself too seriously. And that way we tend to build a few more bridges and make a few more friends. And thank you for your interest in this.
Joel, I hope you can go into the business of turning your lunacy into a kind of virus and more people have it. I think it would be good for the world and certainly good for the soil and the environment.
Thank you very much, Andrew.